So it is with a really great pleasure that I want to introduce a very old friend and colleague in Prout and Anandamarga to Chandra Shekhara, or Craig Rundy. Is been a very, very long time involved in the mission. Late 60s or early 70s, and throughout all that period, he has a legal expert background, and he can tell more about himself, but he's really done a deep dive and focus for all these decades on Prout's concepts of world government and constitutional, let's say, revolution, not reform, and is in the process of preparing a massive book, which is a collection of references and excerpts about that and putting them in a context. So without any further words from my side, I'd like to hand it over to our very able and capable guest speaker, Chandra Shekhara.
Namaskar. Thank you, Dadaji, very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and see people I haven't seen in a long time. In 1990, I was inspired by Baba. I'll call Baba Sri Sarkar from the rest of the program, to look into and to write a world constitution based on his ideas. And I hadn't been expecting that, but it struck me as a very right kind of thing for me to do because of my background in law. I did some legal work for Anandamarga here, many in the 1970s, and worked on trying to obtain justice for Baba when he was in jail. And so it just struck a chord. And so over many years, been studying this. More recently, have done some writing and prepared a manuscript of a world constitution. I've gotten feedback from Proutists around the world, about more than 25 people so far, which has been very, very helpful. I noticed that the subject seems to have become of more interest lately. There have been a couple of online Prout presentations by Jayanta Kumar from Australia on Sadvipa governance and forms of government. And I think people around the world are seeing that the existing systems don't work. We have the problems of climate, we have war in Europe, which seems to be incapable of being resolved by negotiations. And so the existing system of individual countries and some multinational organizations like the United Nations, they have done some good things, but they seem incapable of addressing the major questions that are occurring today. So in this session, what I'd like to do is to be able to share with you different quotes from Baba's works dealing with various aspects of world government, and then have you reflect on various questions and give your own opinions. And so this will be a bit interactive. I have Dadaji Maheshwarananda and also Amritsara to thank for some of the ideas that went into framing this program. And so I'm going to share some my screen here, and we'll take a look at what we're going to cover here. A number of things. The things that are in red are things that where you're going to be doing. I'm going to ask you to do things, but I'll cover a little bit about what in general, what is world government. An important aspect is looking at the different phases of world government. It's not just a single static thing. Per Baba's idea, or per Sri Sarkar's idea. I'll be asking you why you think he advocated for world government and what rights and benefits a world government would bring to not only the people, but other created beings in this world. We'll then look at what the responsibilities of a world government would be. In other words, what it would do, how it would be structured, and how it would function. Look briefly at the notion of a constitution and what a world constitution would be all about. We'll speak a little bit about implementing a world government, which is one of the biggest challenges, obviously, and has been throughout the sort of history of world government advocacy. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Finally, we're going to ask you to write a preamble to a world constitution, which is sort of like the introductory or introduction to the Constitution with usually a inspirational quality to it based on what you've heard today. And then finally, we'll have time for questions and answers. So let's get started. What is a world government to start with? This is sort of a general definition. It's not Sri Sarkar's, but it's it's a general one found in a encyclopedia of philosophy. World government refers to the idea of all humankind, or in our case, all beings or entities, being united under one common political authority. Now, as I said before, there are different phases of world government in Sri Sarkar's writings. The notion is that world government is something that is established in the beginning and it is strengthened as it goes along. And as it strengthens, it takes on more responsibilities, has a more complex structure until it reaches a point that is a fully functioning government, somewhat like the ones that we would think of in maybe a country, but this would be for the world. I wanted to give you several quotes from Sri Sarkar's discourses that emphasize this notion of world government being something that is strengthened over time. This one from Socioeconomic Groupifications. The need for a world government is already apparent to many people. And in the future, once it is established, its powers should be progressively strengthened. Another from Discourses on Prout. If we are to shake off these isms, we have to organize a universal body and go on strengthening its power. This will be the first phase in establishing a world government. And from Problems of the Day, divergent national interests and popular skepticism may stand in the way of the formation of a world government. To allay baseless fears from the minds of the people, this task should be carried out step by step. Obstacles will have to be negotiated with an open mind, and the world government will have to be strengthened gradually, not suddenly. And what I find here is that as in a number of contexts, Sri Sarkar is looking at the establishment, the growth of a particular institution in psychological terms, in a way that will allow people to be able to psychologically adjust to the changes. I was looking the other day at another discourse called Agrarian Revolution. All right. And in that, it talks about the advent of cooperatives in an agrarian context, agricultural cooperatives. And rather than having land of people taken and turned over immediately to a co-op, there's a step-by-step process that's laid out that allows people to, be able to gradually adjust to what in effect is socialization of land. And I think that the same thing is true here, that we're looking at a step-by-step process to allow people to adjust, to get over their skepticism, biases, and adjust to this concept of a world government that really has not been in place before. Okay. Now, what are some of these phases of government? Sri Sarkar actually talks about an initial phase. And in this context, there would be the structure of that government would be somewhat like a global legislature, which would have upper and lower houses with people sent from different countries, either elected or sent by their country. The two houses would, the lower house would be constituted from based on population of the different countries. Bigger countries would have more people, smaller less. The upper house would have perhaps one representative from every country, but in effect, every country, even tiny ones, would have the opportunity to have a say in what's going on, because both houses would need to pass legislation, which would start in the lower house and be affirmed by the upper house. So the idea of it was a global legislation, and the function of it is simply to frame laws. It's not to do all the other things that governments do, but rather to make laws, frame laws, and then to carry out those laws. It would depend on the authorities in the different countries or local governments to actually execute and administer those laws. So this is it's a big step in some ways, but it's not a giant step to an entire world government. It's a first step, described as the initial phase, and this comes from Problems of the Day and Discourses on Prout, if you wanted to look at that. There's a second phase, and maybe another phase, probably a better way to put it, and this is my term for it, confederation phase. Sri Sarkar doesn't call it a confederation phase. But in this phase, there's a more refined or a more expansive structure, actually, of government. It's treated as a confederation of all the federated states or countries of the world. A confederation is a grouping together of countries, in this case, that where the central government has some authority. There's still some autonomy in the countries, but in general, it is a closer kind of relationship than would have existed in the initial phase. Each of these federated states or countries, and this is not a quote, I'm just summarizing it. Each of the federated states or countries would be made up of socioeconomic units. So this is a whole new element of the governmental structure. The socioeconomic units would have dictatorial boards or boards run by Sadvipuras. The socioeconomic unit boards would form together to create what are called federated boards, which would be like countrywide boards. So you have boards running socioeconomic units, you would have boards running countries, and the collection of all those country or federated boards would be called the Confederation Board, which is in effect the world government. So you would have socioeconomic units, countries, and the world, each being run by boards of Sadvipuras. Yet the function, as this phase is initially described, the function that it would take on is framing laws, which had already been in effect in the initial phase, and also the exercise of some limited and defined executive powers or administrative powers. And the example given is that the Confederation would maintain and control a world militia to establish and maintain peace among the various countries. This comes from the discourse, The Observer's Diary, formerly called Talks on Prout. And then a third phase, or another phase, this is yet a later phase, is one where there's a vesting of the full administrative authority of government in the world government. Before, it only had limited executive functions and the right to pass laws. Now it has the full flavor of a government. Sadvipra boards would be overseeing the different traditional branches of government, such as legislature, executive, judicial. There would also be an audit branch, which is a relatively new addition by Sri Sarkar. And there would be a policy making and oversight board called the Supreme Board of Sadvipras, which would oversee all of the other boards. And finally, there would be a bureaucracy or people working in the executive part of the government who would be appointed. Now, the function of this government would be pretty much all of the traditional types of governmental functions that we think of now: making policy, framing laws, executing those laws, interpreting the laws by the judiciary, maintaining oversight of expenditures by the audit branch, and any other responsibilities that the government would have. This kind of description of a mature phase comes from the discourses Sadvipra boards, The Future of Democracy, which was formerly a compartmentalized democracy, and Problems of the Day. Now, the idea of world government is mentioned in quite a few of Sri Sarkar's discourses over a 30-year period. Many of these, and many of the most significant ones, occur during a 5-year period from 1957 to 1961, which is a time in the world where there was a lot of thinking about world governments. It was relatively soon after the end of World War II and the horrors of war that people experienced. And it got many people thinking about this notion of creating a world government to overcome the problems of countries fighting against each other. There were significant movements in England, France, United States, a lot of movements in India as well. So it was a rich time for this kind of thinking. What I'd like to ask now is for you to think about why you think Sri Sarkar was advocating for a world government. And what I'd like to do is ask people at Ananda Gauri to get together, either in maybe 2 or 3 people together, and talk for about 5 minutes among yourselves about why you think Sri Sarkar would have advocated world government very early on after the establishment of Ananda Marga. This would have been, late 1950s, essentially. People who are on Zoom, I'd like you to just think about it yourself, and then after about 5 or 6 minutes, I will ask for people at Ananda Gauri to share some of your observations. People who are on Zoom, please put your observations in the chat room, and we'll read out a few of those for you. So we've got about 15 minutes here. If you can move quickly into groups of 2 or 3 in Ananda Gauri, and then start thinking on your own in Zoom about why you think Sri Sarkar advocated for world government. See you in a couple minutes. I'm going to have you do about one more minute, All right, even though everybody may not be fully done, can we get back together? And somebody there at Anandagari, can you help bring us back together?
Yeah, I will. So we are done. Can we all finish the conversation?
We'd like to hear some of their ideas.
Yeah, we would like to hear some of your ideas.
Obviously, you'll have to use a stick or something to.
Yeah, we have some.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Let's take a
Yeah.
few, maybe just for time's sake, maybe limit yourself to a minute. Be concise. What are some, of the different groups, what are some of your ideas about why Sri Sarkar would have advocated for world government, particularly back in the late 1950s? Anyone can start. And
Well, one thing is that there'd been a Second World War, and the need for an consideration of how to proceed that that had the world community more united. That'd be one consideration.
excellent.
And the other thing was that if the concept of world government hadn't been on the table, as it were, the development of Prout would look differently than it does with a world government structure in taken into account.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's get a couple more groups.
Like to go after?
So to prevent war, to prevent imperialism, and to prevent to give a body that could interfere in national issues where human rights were being abused.
Thank you.
So imperialism and human rights.
Yeah, so we thought that the vision of Prout and other movements is to localize. But then if you look really at things nowadays, humanity has got some needs that have to be met just by commercialization of some goods. So the government should be, I think, somebody pretend that the government should be there to manage this, the production, the sourcing, and the commercialization of these resources and goods that are not present in each and every bioregion, how you call it, biodistrict in Prout. So to supply to each and every bioregion with the things, with goods and services and products, for example, technology or heavy industry products that needs big processes and big amount of energy to produce, to every district, to then avoid situation in which one doesn't have what the other has. So then eventually war will happen and inequalities can rise with some problems.
Thank you. Very good. Let me read a couple of the chat comments from people on Zoom. One person says, I think Pierre Sarkar advocated for a world government because there have been so many conflicts among different nations. The proof was World War II. Another one, because it would be easier to bring people together at all levels. With the time, it would be easier to spread a common spiritual philosophy and make people part of one universal family, Nanda Parivara. It would be easier to educate people about caring for the environment because these teachers would come from all countries. Set a base before capital consumerism got a strong foothold, and to reduce divisive conflicts among people and to protect the world's environment, diversity, plants, and animals. How about one more from Ananda Gauri, and then we'll take a step forward, or take the next step. One more? Lalita?
I think we had many points in common with everybody else, such as one universal family, and that's the basis of Baba's philosophy and everything. So, but also to be policy making of justice and basic human rights and so on, and rational distribution of whatever is not utilized in the regions. As soon as we have basic necessities, we need to look where the rest is needed of the resources. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that what's good is thinking about the kinds of things that would stimulate this. I want to show you a few there it is. Comments from Baba that I think are nicely summarize many of the things that you were just talking about. One of them was, this is from the Observer's Diary, or formerly Talks on Prout. To materialize the concept of universalism, a world government is necessary. And then from one of the discourses in neo-humanism, this neo-humanism will elevate humanism to universalism, the cult of love for all created beings of this universe. So the world government is going to be a necessity in effect, cultivating or having that cult of love for all created beings of this universe. Other comments: to prevent governments from framing laws detrimental to the interest of minorities, and to prevent governments from inflicting atrocities on linguistic, religious, or political minorities. So this human rights concept that had come up, these things are found in discourses on Prout, and also Problems of the Day, and at the very end of the discourse called Justice, where it says that a world government would need to intervene in countries' affairs when those kinds of human rights were being abused. So we see a few, there's one other which I think relates to the what you were talking about in terms of conflict. This is from some questions and answers on society, part 2. This is a summary, but the advent of a world government and a world militia would save huge expenses, would reduce psychic tension, reduce bloodshed, and enable free movement of people around the world. I mean, that's true in the time of World War II, but of course it's true today because of the war in Ukraine. So we're going to put you back to work again, but this time thinking about, okay, so Sri Sarkar is advocating for the formation of a world government. We'll be talking about what that looks like in a little while, but if a world government is formed, how will that benefit, or what kind of rights would be available as a result of that for humans, animals, plants, even inanimate objects, the ecology as a whole? What kind of rights do you think would be in a world constitution, but would be upheld and supported by a world government? I mean, it would be possible to have a dictatorial, an authoritarian world government of a bad kind that was just suppressing people, but that's not the case in Sri Sarkar's vision. He's looking at a government that's going to be providing very uplifting things for people. So once again, ask you to get back into your groups and think about, for a few minutes, what kind of rights or benefits would a world government provide to humans, animals, plants, even inanimate entities? And then after a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes of sharing, we'll stop and come back and see what you've come up with. And then I'll share some observations from Sri Sarkar's writings. Okay, let's go.
Some people here at Ananda Gaudi are asking to see the question again.
I'll put it back on the screen.
Thank you.
There it is.
Thank you.
Gotta have things moving. Maheshwar, are you ready to bring them back now?
Yeah, maybe we can give them 1 minute.
Yeah, why don't you
Yeah.
give 1 minute warning and then bring them
Yeah,
back up?
yeah, thank you. So 1 more minute, please. And then we move back.
All right. Okay. Maheshwar, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Good. Thank you very much again. I can tell that there's some spirited discussion. Let me start this time by reading some of the comments in the chat room. This one is from Chitra. I think the rights and benefits a world government would provide to humans, animals and plants, and inanimate entities would include all living on an equal basis with mutual respect for a sustainable peace and environment. And in parentheses, a neo-humanistic view. From Vishwashanti, the right of existence to realize each entity's innate potential. From Ranjita, not exploitation, a possibility to express one's own, or express the own potentiality. And finally, from Sunita, world government is not an inanimate entity, but run by people. So should, in my opinion, be guaranteed that individuals high or highest states of consciousness. Imagine individuals who attain nirvikalpa samadhi, then government from that, then governed from that state of consciousness. Quiet government. But I think one thing that's interesting in these comments is you see that from the standpoint of what would be the rights or benefits from having a world government, somehow that they would be that it would be supportive of both spiritual and neo-humanistic views, which is, I think, a very interesting part, because clearly in some of Sri Sarkar's discourses, the idea that spirituality, neo-humanism, and Prout are all important and work together for uplift is, I think, quite significant. How about let's get some comments from groups at Ananda Gauri.
So, three things that came to mind. One was by removing boundaries between countries, it would enable greater recognition of the human family, or that and secondly, it would limit strong countries exploiting weak countries, and it would also, thirdly, lessen or by lessening nationalism, it would thereby heighten a universalistic outlook, and finally constrain countries' ability to destroy the environment, such as we're witnessing in the Amazon.
Very good. Let's get a couple more.
I'm just remembering an article or a discourse of Baba's called Requirements of an Ideal Constitution. And the first one was that the existential rights of animals and plants must be guaranteed. The second one was the minimum necessities should be guaranteed. And the second, another one was that purchasing capacity should be guaranteed. Another one was that I think it's something like the right to speak your own language. And the last one that I remember is the right to practice Dharma, your spiritual, the right to do spiritual practices.
Very good. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. Anybody else? Extra points?
Yeah, so we talk about many points, but there was a freedom of movement and freedom from discrimination, whether regarding sex, race, caste, and etc. Yeah, rights of living beings and inanimate objects guaranteed. Yeah, rights of minorities and yeah, rights to fair participation in the economy. So I guess that would be a purchasing power guarantee. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you all. I think that you've pretty much written the Bill of Rights.
There is another person here
Okay.
that wants to speak. Thank you.
Just quick, I think that before getting to world government, as you said, has to be progress and, you know, slowly, little by little. So I think in the process of making this happen already, there are going to be quite a lot of awareness of what should be done according in terms of meeting each other basic needs. So what I think it should be done from the government at that point is to maintain this, because there will be possibly some body, which is a human or is a group of humans or an institution that then try to find a way to make something bigger and, you know, accumulate, or so to maintain this set of ethics and eventually rules. We call them rules or limits that, you know, the government is there to supposed to do what? To control and, you know, control that the order is maintained and should not be negative. It could be a positive thing. It should not just seen as a limitation. It could be some, you know, guidelines that has to be maintained. What I'm saying is to maintain it in time after it's been established.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I was very impressed. Either you've done a good job of reading before the program, or you've had some very similar thoughts to Sri Sarkar. Let me share with you the key reading from the discourse that Dadaji had mentioned, Requirements of an Ideal Constitution, which is one of the significant discourses related to World Constitution. At the end of that particular discourse, after he has said that a world government will need a world constitution, Sri Sarkar says that a charter of principles or Bill of Rights should be included in such a constitution and encompass at least the following four areas. It means it can do more, but at least the following four areas. First, complete security should be guaranteed to all the plants and animals on the planet. Secondly, each country must guarantee purchasing power to all its citizens. Thirdly, the Constitution should guarantee four fundamental rights: spiritual practice or Dharma, cultural legacy, education, and indigenous linguistic expression. And fourthly, if the practice of any of these rights conflicts with cardinal human values, then that practice should be immediately curtailed. One of the things that's been interesting, and I've gotten feedback from probably 25 or more Proutists, as I say, around the world on the draft of the Constitution thus far. And one of the, just one second. Sorry. Okay. Little music, little background music. The two of the areas that have been probably not necessarily controversial, but ones that people have had questions about were, one, the idea of providing complete security for all the plants and animals in the world. People say that's impossible and nobody could live and so forth. And what I've said so far to them is that the idea of this, I mean, it's obvious that it's probably impossible to actually guarantee every single plant and animal in the world complete security. But it is certainly underpinned by neo-humanistic sentiment, and it is balanced by the last comment in that reading, which was the idea that if any of the rights conflicts with the concept of cardinal human principles, that right would be curtailed. And in this case, the idea is that you wouldn't say that human beings can't eat because they would have to eat a plant to survive, because so you can't have complete security and no plant can ever be eaten, because it would mean that people would starve to death, and that would be against Sri Sarkar's idea of cardinal human principles. Of course, then you have to go into the more depth with respect to what are cardinal human principles. In some places, he talks about them as people acting in accordance with Jamaniyam as acting in accordance with cardinal human principles. Other people say that's too narrow of a definition for this particular case. But fundamentally, you're looking at those kind of values that people typically around the world believe in, not harming others, not stealing from others and so forth, which in many cases are part of Jamaniyama. So it's a balancing act that Sri Sarkar puts in here, and one that really takes some careful thinking to come up with a proposition on. Now, let me go to the next slide just to say that I think you touched on many of the other fundamental rights that are found in different places in Sri Sarkar's discourses. Equal rights and opportunities, freedom of thought and speech, which come from discourses on Prout, freedom of movement and the right to settle around the world, but no boundaries, and freedom from injustice because of sex, race, caste, economic status. One thing that's also important in looking at the rights of people is whether or not they can enforce them. You can have rights that look very pretty on paper, but if there's no way for people to actually make sure that they are accorded those rights, then they're sort of meaningless. And so in the discourse quadridimensional economy, and to some extent in the discourse justice, you'll see comments there that look to the idea of the people having the right to either sue the government or have some other administrative process whereby they can in fact enforce the rights that they are accorded under the Constitution. Now we're at about 10 minutes after the hour. I think it's about 10 after, about 15:10 there. If Maheshwar, if people would like to take a break, this would be the appropriate time for it. Then we'll come back and finish up. Or if people want to just stay and go straight on through, that's okay too. You let me know which works best.
I think we'd better go
Okay,
No break is necessary.
Maheshwar, how about
No.
the Nandagawa?
Yeah, it seems like people also don't need a break here.
Okay, these are hardcore Proutists. Breaks
Exactly.
breaks are
They're
for
u-
other people.
They're
We're
used to
moving
sitting
forward.
for sadhana for hours, you know. So
Yeah, okay. Very good. All right, so let's go back. And we will look at the next step, which has to do with, what are the- okay? We're gonna look at what are some of the responsibilities or duties, or in effect, what's the job of government in this context? I have a number of activities that are presumed that government should do, plus the source where they've come from. And I'm happy to provide copies of this slideshow. I can get it to Maheshwar and he could share it with you if you want. But what are some of them? Well, first of all, protecting and supporting the rights that were in the Charter of Principles that were talked about in the requirements of an ideal constitution. The government has to do something sometimes to make sure. And I mean, for example, one of the rights is the guaranteed purchasing power. Well, that just doesn't happen. And by the fact that it's in the Constitution, means that the world government has to work with, in effect, country level governments or lower level governments to make sure that this, in fact, is a right that's provided. And it's not just that, that people have money, but they're actually the things to buy, the guaranteed necessities are, in fact, there. From the discourse, the cosmic brotherhood, there's a suggestion that the world government would also collaborate in the formation of socioeconomic units. Some of those socioeconomic units, the Samaj, will come up from sort of grassroots type of organization, but there's a role for the world government in the view of Sri Sarkar in terms of helping form those. Safeguarding the peace, which is related to the having control over a global or world militia that would prevent fighting between the different countries or even within different socioeconomic units. Something that you've touched on, the idea of promoting unity among all of the global family, the Nanda Parivara. Helping, but not leading, decentralized economic planning. The idea is that political institutions would be centralized, economic planning would be decentralized, but the global government could have a role in providing expertise or resources in helping local economies do their own planning, but not telling local economies what to do. Safeguarding the environment is expressly referenced in the Renaissance in all the strata of life discourse. Protecting disadvantaged people. And one that isn't necessarily explicit in Sri Sarkar's writings, but is necessarily a part of a government responsibility. There are areas within the planet that probably will not fall within the jurisdiction of any particular socioeconomic unit or country. That things like the oceans, perhaps the Antarctica, and the atmosphere around the planet or the moon. These kind of areas, somebody has to govern, somebody has to make sure that the rights are provided for the entities that live there. And so the world government, in my reading of it, would be doing that. Now, with these rights having been established and the responsibilities being laid out, the governmental responsibilities being laid out, the next question becomes, well, how would you structure a world government. And we talked earlier about different phases. In the first phase of world government, it's just a legislature, a two-house legislature, sometimes called a bicameral legislature. In the confederation phase, it's a little bit more involved because the government would have the duty of overseeing or controlling the world militia. But in a mature phase of world government, what would that look like? Well, let's take a look. The government structure, it would have branches of government which we are generally familiar with. Legislature for making laws, executive branch for administering the laws, getting things done, judicial branch for both overseeing criminal types of trials, but also interpreting laws, making sure that they're in line with the Constitution, and an audit branch which makes sure that expenditures of government are being done properly. Now, the other piece of this is that all of those branches of government are overseen by a benevolent dictatorship. This, of course, is for some people a problematic term because of in the 20th century, there have been a number of dictatorships that have been anything but benevolent. In history, there probably have been some dictatorships where the one person or a small group have pretty much absolute authority, but they have in fact governed for the benefit of the people. But that is not a very much of a modern kind of reality. So people are concerned about that. But it's not just any kind of dictatorship or benevolent dictatorship. It's one of Sadvipra's, and we'll talk about that in a little more depth. All of this discussion comes from a discourse called The Future of Democracy, which is formerly called Compartmentalized Democracy. Now, let's look at this notion of Sadvipra boards a little bit more, or the dictatorial benevolent dictatorship of Sadvipra's. What form will this take? This is a quote from the discourse, Sadvipra boards. Prout supports the idea of centralization of political power and decentralization of economic power. But centralization of political power does not mean centralization in one person or one institution. So Sadvipras will elect and form several boards consisting of persons who are conversant with and experienced in the various branches of administration. So we have several things going on here. Centralization of political power, this being centralized in a number of boards consisting of people who are conversant with how to run a government. And that Sadvipras will be electing these persons. And in fact, we'll see the persons who are on these boards are themselves Sadvipras. One of the boards, and this is the one that will oversee all of the other boards, is called the Supreme Board of Sadvipras. It frames the policies of government. It oversees the operation of the other boards and branches of government. It has a chairperson who is in effect the constitutional head of the government. It elects ministers to head the different departments that would be in the executive branch, and I would say that it also it defines what departments will be in the executive branch of government. And it selects good people to carry out different executive duties and appoints high-ranking officials. These points are from discourses on Prout and Sadvipra boards, but it basically puts the Supreme Board of Sadvipras in a very significant role of making policy and overseeing the rest of the government. It therefore becomes important to make sure that this board of Sadvipras operates effectively and doesn't abuse powers, and we'll talk about that later. There are other Sadvipra boards that are envisioned by Sri Sarkar. One is called a Legislative Board of Sadvipras. They frame laws based on the principles of Prout and also on policies established by the Supreme Board of Sadvipras, the one we were just talking about. There's an executive board of Sadvipras. They, in effect, materialize or carry out the laws that are framed by the legislative board of Sadvipras. And they also supervise the selection of people who serve in the bureaucracy. These are the people who make the government run day to day. A judicial board of Sadvipras, they put together the rules and procedures for appointing judges and other people in the judicial branch of government. And then finally, there's an audit branch of government, as we've said. This is a relatively new addition to the idea of multi-part government. It's not clear. It does not appear explicitly as a audit board of Sadvipras. It may or may not take that form. And if it does, it would be something that would be established in the future. But it clearly is one of the four branches of the government. Now, the question is, how do you go about choosing the personnel? Well, in Discourses on Prout, there is a description of a particular process of choosing personnel. And let me just read the quote. The synthetic portion of the government will be electional, and the analytic portion will be selectional. The synthetic portion will dictate policy matters, and the analytic portion will execute the accepted policy. Thus, our socio-economic, political structure will be selecto-electional. In this case, essentially, the various Sadvipra boards that we were just talking about are going to be elected. And who will elect them? Sadvipras will elect them. And how does that process work? Well, it's an interesting question. It was one discussed by Jayanta Kumar in his earlier presentations on Sadvipra governance. But fundamentally, the idea is that there would be an electoral commission who would be established to oversee who would be able to serve as an elector or a voter. These people themselves would become eligible to vote. They'd be on the rolls as voters, and they would need to be Sadvipras. And how would you determine if someone is a Sadvipra? Would use the various criteria for the description or definition of Sadvipras as a basis for the Electoral Commission determining who is authorized to vote. Those voters would elect the Sadvipra boards in their jurisdictions. Once you have, and then in terms of who could run as a candidate, it would be people who are Sadvipras. Once again, they'd meet the criteria defined by an electoral commission, and they would also need to show that they had a sufficient level of experience in the administrative aspect of the government for which they would be running. Then these various Sadvipra boards would be clearly involved in choosing or selecting other people to serve in the bureaucracy and the judicial personnel, people who do the day-to-day work as opposed to overseeing it. So we have a combination of selecto and electional. Now, if you have any questions about that, I mean, that's a very quick overview of it, but feel free to ask those questions during the question answer time at the end. In terms of what will be the function of a world constitution in relationship to the world government that we're talking about. Again, from the discourse, Requirements of an Ideal Constitution, Sri Shekhara says, the guidebook in which all such rules, regulations, and principles for the proper conduct of a state, or in this case the world, are codified is called a constitution. A constitution guides a state with policies and principles to render all-round services to the people for their rapid progress. So basically this constitution, a world constitution, will guide the conduct of a world government, and underlying it is the notion that the government should be rendering all-round services to the people, or at least supporting that, for their rapid progress. And who should write the World Constitution? Well, as time goes on, once there's an initial one, it can be amended, and there are processes that Sri Shekhara suggests for amending a constitution, but who should write the original one? In the discourse called Justice, he says that the constitution of the world should be drafted by a global organization recognized by the people. Otherwise, the possibility exists that at any moment, a minority in a country might be persecuted. So some kind of a global organization recognized by the people and presumably supported by the people as well. There are various kinds of approaches to this. One might say, oh, today that could be the United Nations. Well, it's probably recognized by a lot of people. Supported, maybe not as widely, but it could be that. It could be whatever group might be involved in actually implementing or establishing a world government. We'll talk about the idea of how do you implement a world government next, but presumably there are some groups of people who will work to establish the world government, and that group or groups of people might in fact form a global organization, and they might become the ones who draft a global constitution, world constitution. And a third possibility is that you just form the government, get it started, and then let the government itself write its own constitution. This happens in certain kind of cases. And it's not completely known, but at least the idea is that it should be a global organization rather than one person or a small little group of people in some room hashing out a constitution, but a global organization recognized by the people. So what I'm writing is not really the world constitution, it's just ideas that could be used, hopefully, by people wanting to create. Now, how do you go about forming a world government, implementing it? You know, it's interesting, I had mentioned it before that there were lots of ideas being discussed after World War II and in late 1950s around the world for how do you create a global government, a world government. And indeed, there were a number of world constitutions or draft world constitutions actually created. Some were done by academics at very prestigious institutions. And some were done more by grassroots groups who felt the need for doing something to prevent yet another world war with all its suffering. The problem, they've drafted some very nice constitutions. There are a number of examples already in existence. I mean, they're different than the one that Sri Shekhara, I think, would support, but still they're good. And the problem that they all face is to try to get them implemented, or try to get the world government that the Constitution would support implemented. And why? Well, one of the main obstacles that Sri Sarkar notes is the resistance of local officials, country level officials, who, if a world government was established, would lose their power. And that's a big issue, because around the world, many of those people, at least at this point in time, are in relatively powerful positions. Yet the world changes. There will be great pressures that occur over time that may overcome those that resistance by local officials. The people may overcome it. Climate change, wars, environmental degradation. There's a lot of things that are happening, and also changes in demography. You know, right now, United States and China are the two richest countries in the world. Probably by 2025, China and India will be the two richest countries in the world. And as of next year, India will be the largest country in the world. So there's a lot of changes happening that may affect things in ways that are not obviously apparent now. And there's also the movement of the social cycle. And how will that change things as we move from Vaishyan era into Katrian era and so forth, or Katrian into Vipra? There's a lot of things happening that mean that the status quo does not have to stay there, even though it seems so big and hard to change. But let's look at this. So in the mature phase of government, which we've been talking about, a more complete, fully vested operational government, what kind of things are needed to implement that? What's interesting is that, let me go back here, I'm sorry. To implement, or effectively implement, a mature world government, what's needed is enough Sadvipras to be able to run the government. People who have the qualities of Sadvipras, who also have experience in government. And because the world is a big place, there's a number of people who are needed. It's not completely clear exactly how many you have to have, and it doesn't seem to be the case that you have to have Sadvipras in every single bureaucratic position in the government, from the clerks on up to the ministers. But I think that at least in the higher level areas of government, Sadvipras are assumed to be in place. And to get there, it's going to require Sadvipra training, I think, training with respect to psychic and spiritual development, and in a very interesting discourse, which I encourage for you, called The Transformation of Psycho-Spiritual Pabula, Psychic Pabula into Psycho-Spiritual Pabulum. There's a very interesting last paragraph that talks about the idea of, if we're able to help people effectively channelize their psychic pabula into psychospiritual pabulum, then we will create Sadvipras of everyone. So the idea is that there are ways of increasing the numbers of Sadvipras a great deal. And we need to look into that at, sooner than later, I think. Now, the earlier phases, this could be the initial phase and or the sort of confederation phase that I was talking about, where you see the first confederating together of countries and emergence of socioeconomic units, the initial dictatorial boards and so forth. These probably are accomplished in different ways. This is from Problems of the Day, and just let me read it quickly. The greatest social welfare for the human race will be accomplished if those who aspire to establish the world government or Ananda Parivara engage themselves only in constructive activities and selfless service, instead of wasting their vital energy in the vortex of politics or in political conflicts. They will have to go on rendering social service with steadfast commitment without any ulterior motive in their minds. And those states which cooperate with such missionaries in their social service activities will be considered to be desirous of establishing the world government or Ananda Parivara. The common people of those states which do not cooperate will become agitated, and these agitated people will form the world government or Ananda Parivara through revolution. For this, the missionaries need not enter the dirty arena of party politics. Now, in some respects, this is a admonition against getting too sucked into political conflict as the means of attempting to establish world government. Not that a considered participation in certain politics is forbidden, but you don't want to see that as the main way to establishing world government. And I think the beginning hint that at least in those areas where the governments are resisted the notion of world government, that the people there will eventually establish it through revolution. So we begin to see the notion of revolution as a part of this. This is from the Observer's Diary, formerly Talks on Prout. Ananda Parivara, or establishing a universal spiritual family, involves not only a world government, but a universal government. More correctly, it is a universal social order. The question is, how can such a Parivara be established? This will certainly come through revolution, which may be democratic or undemocratic, or it may be pyramidical, palace, or nuclear revolution. Among all the types of revolution, nuclear revolution is the best. So we see a little bit more here, although the focus is not expressly on world government, although it is brought up, but the idea of establishing world government, that there may be elements of revolution, and in particular it points out the idea of nuclear revolution. And from the discourse on nuclear revolution, Prout advocates another type of revolution called nuclear revolution. In nuclear revolution, every aspect of collective life, social, economic, political, cultural, psychic, and spiritual, is completely transformed. New moral and spiritual values arise in society, which provide the impetus for accelerated social progress. The old era is replaced by a new era. One collective psychology is replaced by another. This type of revolution results in all-round development and social progress. Now, it seems pretty clear that here that it's talking more about a revolution in the context of the social cycle, although I think that elements of nuclear revolution in terms of the implementation of world government may also be fully appropriate. New ideas, new views, transforming the way people see things, because one of the things that keeps people stuck in the existing global political structure of sovereign countries is sort of psychological. This is the way it's been, and this is the only way it can be. That, in addition to the local political leaders wanting to hold on to their power at all cost. So creating a stir in the mental life of the world through nuclear revolution may well be a part of this ultimately establishment of world government, particularly in its earlier phases. For time-wise, let me go on to this last section. A constitutional preamble is something that states the purpose and intention of the whole document. It makes clear what is to be expected in the Constitution, and it is usually an inspirational type of message. And what I'd like to suggest now is, once again, you get together in groups and we spend a little time thinking about drafting a preamble for the World Constitution based on what we've covered today. And who knows, what you create may in fact inspire people in a future era when they draft a preamble to the World Constitution. So if you'll get together in groups, give you maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and then I'd like to hear some of the preambles that you come up with. And people on Zoom, you can type it in the chat. We'll ask for verbal comments from people in the gallery. And I'll look forward to seeing you in about 7 minutes. That's not much time, so you got to get right to it. Sometimes doing things quick is actually good. Well, sure. Why don't we try a couple more minutes? Maheshwar, why don't we get people back now, okay?
Yeah, we are just about done.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay,
So let's proceed.
very good. We had one suggestion in the chat room from Vishwa Shanti. He says that as a preamble, which are usually shorter kind of statements. He says, "We, the people of planet Earth, in order to protect and preserve this planet's entities and to provide each entity its right to realize its potential, do propose this Constitution." Nice start. Let's add some more thoughts. And if you don't have a full preamble, just whatever, we'll stitch one together from various thoughts.
In Iceland, after we had the bank collapse, we had the elections for representatives into, who were supposed to make a draft for, or not only a draft, to make a new constitution. So we still have that, but the parliament did not agree about it, so they just see it as an advisory, so, yes, and not that they are bounded, by the elections. So we have so you could say that, that one is quite revolutionary in many sense. So that there you have some draft, to at least have a look at, about the distribution of wealth and about the protection of nature. It has many, many good points. Thank you.
No, that's good. And some people have suggested using the idea of cosmic inheritance as sort of an underlying principle of the preamble of the Constitution as well. But I think that it sounds like that's something that's actually in the proposed preamble for Iceland. So that's interesting. Thank you.
So we haven't actually written it so nicely as Vishwa Shanti, but
Well, he had a computer in front of him. It made it easier.
points to include, I think, could include the following: that a preamble would recognize that the world government would enable or encourage the fairness for people, plants, and animals, for example, by stopping the oppression of minorities. That it would usher in or provide the prospect of a more peaceful coexistence. You know, given that the militia would be in the hands of the world government rather than nationalistic nation states. That there be a neo Magna Carta recognizing the rights of all species to exist. That self-sufficiency would underpin economic regional well-being. And importantly, I think that having SADVIPRA boards across that SADVIPRA boards would necessarily ensure that such a development was underpinned by had a spiritual basis.
Thank you very much. Here's another comment from the chat room. The first part of which is very similar to the preamble of the US Constitution. We the people of the planet Earth, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the cosmic inheritance to all, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the world. It's interesting because you begin to hear that even in the preamble, which is sort of almost like, it comes first, but it's not generally looked at as the essential law portion of the Constitution, but more of an inspirational portion. You hear the themes of neo-humanism coming out, which I think are completely appropriate, the cosmic inheritance and other things as well. So these are very good. Is there anyone else there that wants to share? I ask because I can't really see.
The numbers in the room have dwindled, and I suspect it's to do with the fact that this whole concept of world government is futuristic, and that brings me to a question that I have.
Yeah, and we can go to questions and answers now. That's fine.
A useful question would be, in my mind, what sort of timeline could be envisaged? Because if we have in mind, that this is the goal that we want to achieve by such and such a date, it focuses our mind a bit more. And I think it'll be constrained by the SADVIPRA, the presence of SADVIPRAs.
Yes. No, I think it's a very good question, and I've heard a variety of comments, anywhere from even within the century to even a longer time frame. Of course, we're talking about different phases, and so I think it would clearly, the mature world government would be later, because it needs large numbers of SADVIPRAs and so forth. I think that I've presented it in this way, in part because of some suggestions from Brother Chabot from Australia. He's does future studies. And one suggestion is that in order to know where you're going, it's good to have a vision of it. And even though this is a rather radical vision and perhaps long-term vision, it begins to talk to you about what kind of things are needed to be done to get there. One of which is the development of larger numbers of SADVIPRAs. Before that, in the very earliest stages, just a law-framing world government, that's a much less of a jump from here, but it's not a trivial one, because to what extent do you see the countries of the world right now being willing to give over their law-making responsibilities to world government so that they no longer have it? Even that is uncertain, and I think that from my perspective, it is likely that some of the issues that we are facing that will shake the foundation of our current society will probably be important in actually achieving this. You know, as we see the climate change and the severe repercussions on our economy and social institutions, it becomes much less easy to just go along with the way things are now, and people will become more agitated. I think that's maybe why, in some respects, you see more young people concerned about the climate crisis than older people, because they're going to have to live it, and the effects are going to be vivid on their lives. And so, I would say it is hard to say for sure when these happen. It's clear that Sri Sarkar doesn't say that it's going to be a specific time. Yet, in some respects, it may be a combination of our own efforts, the efforts of others, and circumstances like climate change and things like that, that will force the movement towards world government. So that's not an exact answer, but I think that that touches on some of the issues that we have. Let me read one more, or a couple more things, and then let me at least say that Ramesh suggested the following preamble: "We, the people of the world, have come together in unity to propose a new global constitution to safeguard the well-being of not only all people, but all living beings, and assure the protection for nature for future generations." Maheshwar, we're probably close to the end of the time, although we didn't quite start on time, but that's okay. If you want questions, we can take them. If you don't, we can end.
Hello. So I also have one question, which I consider vital in this discussion, which is the question of what is a Sadvipra? Because, you know, the existence of a world government and the existence of a Proutist society is based on the existence of a Sadvipras, and or the existence of Sadvipras. And I've talked with many people about what a Sadvipra is, and you know, each person will have their own opinion, which is normal and healthy. And now I would also like to know what is your opinion. What would you consider is a Sadvipra, and what would be the qualities of these leaders in the context of a world government? You already mentioned that they should be conversant in government. They should know how to govern basically. But what else? Yeah, like
I think that I mean the core aspects of Sadvipras, and some people suggest, I know the Jayanta Kumar suggests, that there's sort of different contexts in describing Sadvipras. Some relating to, you know, sort of Anandamarga functions. The bhuktis should be, you know, run by Sadvipras, but there are more general context of Sadvipras being talked about in a societal sense, or even being voters. And it seems pretty clear to me that the key elements, and where the way I approach it is to really look to see what Sri Sarkar has said about Sadvipras. Because before reading his, you know, I'd never encountered Sadvipra in my early studies. So really the term is coming from him. And so what has he said about it? And there's quite a few different things, but very consistently. There's a depiction of people who are not only understand, but in fact follow moral principles. Jamaniyam, I think, for sure. People who are spiritually oriented. In other words, they have a spiritual practice and they're doing that. More than that, they are service-minded people, trying to help others. Those, I think, are sort of some of the key elements. you could, and I think it would probably be good to go through and look at all of the different references to Sadvipras, which I have done at one point in this last year, and see if there are any other characteristics that you would add to that list. You know, almost having a checklist of how would you see it, how would you know a Sadvipra if you saw one? Follows Jamanyam, does spiritual practices, serves other people, but I mean, there are other elements. And so I would develop that. And in the case of people running for government, do they have the requisite experience to actually be able to do the governmental job?
Is it possible to make a comment?
I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Yeah, this is Ramesh here. Yeah, I think those are good points. Also, one of the qualities of a Sadvipra is that a Sadvipra is in the nucleus of the social cycle. In other words, a Sadvipra would have the qualities of a Shudra, a Vaishyan, a Vipran, and a Kshatriyan, but not be embedded in any of these singular qualities, but sort of have a fifth quality, embodying all of those qualities and at the same time be beyond them. And to be able to see and to help move the social cycle forward in a constructive way at the right time and in the best way possible.
Thank you. That's very nice. So in some ways, one of the things I think is helpful is to not only look at what the characteristics of Sadvipras are, but also think about what would be involved in actually creating and helping people become Sadvipras. What kinds of, you know, you have to do something, right? And what kind of training? How would we in fact create larger numbers of Sadvipras? That's, I think, from a policy standpoint, a very important thing to look at, particularly when we get to a place where larger numbers are needed. Earlier, there may not be a need for as many in terms of just the initial establishment of a world government. That may take other types of activity by good-hearted people, though, still. Are there others?
Yes, Tilakabas from Finland. There has been this idea of selector electoral system, and I haven't seen it evolving. You know, what I have read from the earlier years that there are cooperatives who elect or select a representative who then goes to a higher, and then who are again selected to higher and higher boards. I haven't heard anything more than that. Can someone elaborate that? Is there some new development on that regard?
I'm staying quiet to see if somebody else will do that. I mean, it's obviously a part of an express part of how governmental personnel would be chosen in a Proutist system. But for purposes of implementation in co-ops or other places, I don't have an answer.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you for putting this on the table. I think the work is really, it's a really valuable, that we're giving expression to something that Bob has given or has drawn our attention to as being what we need to work towards. There's just a few things that I wanted to mention. One was that in a workshop that we had this morning, one of the ways that Prout was to be promoted and endorsed by, I think in some of what Bubba's written or Saka's written, it was suggesting that political activity was an avenue for that support. But in what some of the quotes that you've provided today, it's talking about political activity being dirty, and there's a bit of a conflict between the two. So that was just two other points. Was with regard to training, and again, I think thanks are due to Dr. Matavidiananda with his Humane World Political Party, insofar as part of that, he's very clear about the scope and the need for Sadvitra training, and he calls and it's quite an explicit aspect of their work, and by doing so, he's once again, as you're doing in putting world government on, drawing that to attention. In doing so, he's highlighting this whole the whole concept of being a Sadvipara and what it takes to become, and the need for. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And one point I think that it is not as though a conscious use of elections or politics is not acceptable from a strategic standpoint, but expecting that to be the avenue for achieving these results is not, and getting wrapped up in it in a way that would divert one's attention, I think, is what is at stake on that. But thank you. I think, and I really appreciate the reference to Dr. Madhuvidyananda. I have to learn more. People have told me about his work, but I've not interacted with him yet. Well, I guess that's about it. And I thank you all very much.
Okay. I had one question for you, Chandra Shekhara.
Yes.
So you mentioned that the opposition from local leaders is one of the reasons why it is difficult to establish world government. But it also seems to me that another major obstacle is the world powers today, the United States, Russia, China, who now have veto power in the United Nations. And it would seem that they would not be interested in having a world government, because that would undermine, their own lust for power. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
No, I think you're right, and maybe it's sort of an extension of that quote from Baba with respect to local leaders being resistant. I mean, in some respects, the people who govern the large countries, China and US and so forth, would fit within that mold. I mean, the Xi Jinping is not exactly a local leader, but from the standpoint of a leader of a jurisdiction or a country, he would be in a similar role. They don't want to give up power. And so in one sense, it looks like a small jump from having the United Nations, which has a General Assembly that can pass resolutions, to turning that into a legislature that actually could pass laws. But it's a huge step. And that's because not only the large countries, but even the small countries won't want to give up their own authority for making laws and being, and having local control. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the big countries are so dominant on the world scene right now, I think further complicates the issue. within the context of the UN, veto powers for Russia, China, U.S., France, and England is a vestige of World War II, but none of them want to give that up, and they're not that interested in adding other countries, India, China, or Japan, Germany, whatever. And so, the status quo is hard to break. And so, from my perspective, I don't see it breaking unless there are circumstances that, in effect, shake the foundation heavily. Now, it's hard to tell whether the outcome of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the changing of political alliances, whether that changes it. I don't think that alone will change the situation, but that coupled with, the world on fire, the climate, is becoming almost undeniable now. And the effects of that, when we have dramatic shortages in food globally, caused by either Ukraine not being able to export it or it burning in the fields and other places, that can very quickly shake things in ways that might enable change. And we have to be somewhat ready, but I think that those things are going to be more likely to contribute to a sooner achievement of some of these changes. So that's some ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Maheshwar, and thank you.
Namaskar. And another comment that just leading off of what you just shared, your last words there, Chandra Shekhara, that it's good, I think, always in that context to keep in mind some somewhat more mysterious things that that Baba used to say. For example, it's a well-known story that he told someone once that we wouldn't know 15 minutes before it happens when Prout would become established, and these many similar stories like that. So I wanted to just comment also, I very much appreciated your, I think, very down-to-earth concept of Sadvipra. I know when Jayanta Kumarji recently gave his presentation, he cited, that only great spiritual personalities historically, like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu or etc., fill the bill in his concept. And I was a bit surprised to hear him say that. I agree with you. I think it's much more down to earth than that. And there are people, it's clearly defined also, part of the process is people are forged in the fire to become those people. But one important quality that you didn't put on your laundry list was fighting spirit and readiness to aggressively struggle against oppression and exploitation. So
thank you for all of those points. You're right that this is all based on spirituality and the idea that God could, in a blink of an eye, it could change. But you're also right that I think that we won't know until just before the galloping leap takes effect that things will happen. So we have to just keep working. I like this. There's one really nice quote. Is this? Yeah, this is from the transformation of psychic pabula into psycho-spiritual pabulum. With a smooth, natural, and progressive channelization of the psychic urges of the individual and collective mind towards the supreme entity, psychic pabula will be converted into psycho-spiritual pabulum. Then each person will be a Sadvipra, and the whole society will be a Sadvipra Samaj, and Ananda Parivara. So the transformation of psychic pabulum into psycho-spiritual pabulum is the only panacea. So I hope we have a large number of Sadvipras the next time we meet.